So this project sits right at the intersection of comparative politics and international relations. And it's about the relationship between oil and foreign policy. And there have been various bodies of literature that have focused on this in the past, but they've been slightly different, right? So energy security literature, which we'll get into a little bit in this presentation, but which is very much about the demand side of energy, right? It's about, you know, importing countries and what they have to do to keep their own energy supplies secure. That's the demand side of energy security. There's a very wide literature on the resource curse, which is like the domestic politics of how oil can shape the policies, the domestic economies of petro-states, the states that produce lots of oil. And then there's been a lot of historical work on nationalizations, on the 1973 oil crises. And so all of those exist out there. But what we don't really have is a good understanding of where it is that petrostates, those oil-producing states, meet the international system. So we understand far less about how oil can shape the foreign policies of a state that is a petrostate, right? We understand a lot about the importers. We don't understand nearly as much about the exporters. And to the extent that there's been work on that in the past, it's focused almost entirely on things like OPEC, does the cartel function, etc. So there's been a small boom in some energy work lately, but most of the work is still in those fields. And that's not at all what I'm trying to do in this book, or what I do in this book. Instead, the book is a framework for understanding the politics of oil-rich states and how that shapes their behavior in the international system. And to that extent, it's not as much a puzzle and answer or a theory, the way some books of international relations or foreign policy are. The book is more a survey or a study, an exploratory look at the different ways in which oil and foreign policy intersect in these states, and how we might try and assess those relationships going forward. So one of the big things that I try to do is get at some of the definitional questions that I think have really undermined some of the debate in the sort of energy space over the years, because we talk a lot about petrostates. It's a word that gets thrown around anecdotally, and then nobody really defines what actually they mean by a petrostate. And so in the book, I suggest a topology that thinks about 3 different ways that a state can interact with their energy. Ignore the 4th one for the moment. We'll get to that in a second. So the first would be an oil-dependent state, a state that exhibits some of the characteristics of the resource curse, perhaps a distorted political economy, a distorted, more authoritarian or corrupt political system. And that's one where, the government is dominated by oil revenues, basically. So classic, usually authoritarian, relatively small state, like some of the ones we see in the Middle East. Then we have what I call oil wealthy states, which is states that earn a lot of money from their resources, but they're not necessarily completely controlled or corrupted by it. So states that earn a lot of money on a per capita basis from revenue sales, but it may or may not have shaped or distorted their domestic political economy in the same way. So this is about the wealth. And then the third category would be either super producer or super exporter states. And super exporters are a subset of super producers. And these are basically the world's biggest oil producers. So states that produce such a large fraction of global supply that their production weighs in the international market. So if something impacts production in a major super producer, the global price of oil shoots up. That's basically what this category is. And I'll talk a little more about the producer-exporter distinction later. But in a nutshell, it helps to think about production as something you either consume or you sell. And states that export or sell most of their energy they have even more leverage in some ways than states that produce a lot, but use it all, consume it all. And so we'll talk a little more about that a little later, because I know that that sounds a little confusing. So let me just very quickly sort of run through these three categories. You know, this is just a list. We can come back to it if it's relevant. These are the states that are oil dependent per the definition in the book. And you can see, you know, it includes a number of small and sort of middle-sized states, many quite corrupt states, many authoritarian states, not all of them by any means, but on average, this group skews in that direction. These are the oil wealthy states. It's a much smaller group of nations. And now you might notice some countries are on both lists, and that is entirely accurate. These three groups are not mutually exclusive. In fact, some countries meet all three of these criteria, and that again shapes the way that they interact with the world in slightly different ways than states that might just be one or two of these things. So these are the oil wealthy states, and although some of those kind of rentier, resource cursed states are in here, we also see some other states start to move into the sample. Canada, America, Nigeria, states that are large and populous, and maybe they produce a lot of oil and they earn a lot of money from oil, but because, you know, they have large populations, or they have other industries, or they discovered oil later in their development trajectory, maybe it hasn't impacted the economy in the same way. And then we have, you know, what you might call the global oil states, or the super producer states. I think global oil is a term left over from a previous draft, I'm afraid to say. Super producer states. And you can see this is quite a different set of countries. Even just running your eye down it, it looks very different. And I'll tell you that if you pull up sort of the summary statistics for these three groups of states, you know, things like GDP or military capacity, you know, this is a much larger, richer, more influential set of states generally, though obviously not every state in here fits that criteria. So those three groups suggest three ways that oil production might shape a state's foreign policy or shape their interactions with the world. And we'll go through all three in turn. So there's wealth, the resource curse, and market share. And I think it's important to highlight just up front that these are not deterministic things, right? Not every state that has oil is going to necessarily exhibit all of these characteristics in foreign policy. But I think it's better to think of them as pathways, right? These are theoretical possibilities, many of which the case studies in the book talk about, we've seen in practice, of the different ways that oil can impact a state's foreign policy. So not necessarily, you know, something that has to happen, but something that can happen. And part of the book is basically sort of figuring out, to some extent, whether these things are happening or not. But you know, there's a broad enough sweep of things here that I'm not able to test them all fully in the book. Let's start with money, because it's the simplest. Money is useful for all kinds of things in foreign policy. Money is useful for all kinds of things in general. Here's one. And I'm afraid this chart got a little cut off, but military expenditure, right? States that are very wealthy from oil revenues tend to spend more in terms of military expenditures. They tend to spend more in terms of they buy more arms. You know, whether you use statistics for US arms sales, whether you use internationalized statistics. In fact, the connection between military expenditure and oil is so strong that oil prices globally and military expenditure globally actually track one another. So when oil prices are high, military expenditure goes up globally and comes back down when oil prices fall. And that's really interesting, because for those who've studied political economy, that's the opposite of what you would expect. You would expect that when oil prices go up and countries that are importers are suffering budgetary strain, they might spend less on their militaries. So the fact that this is reversed is really kind of an interesting indicator. And in fact, when you delve into the data from places like CIPRI, what you find is that some of the biggest arms purchasers, the biggest military spenders in the world, petrostates are disproportionately represented in those kind of top statistics in terms of who's buying arms and who's not. And even for individual states, you can see this pattern pretty strongly. Oil prices and military expenditure, they track one another. They track one another a little more closely on the way up than the way down, which is to say that military spending is a little sticky. It kind of persists a little longer. Oil prices fall and eventually states adapt. But it's notable, and it's meant to be 6 states. You can kind of see 4 here, but I've done this chart for like 15 different states, and in most cases it tracks. And then the statistical analysis in general suggests that it holds pretty constant. So having a lot of oil wealth can buy you a pretty awesome military. Lots of nice weapons. You can spend more on soldiers, you can give them all kinds of perks, you can give them pensions and all kinds of things to increase military retention. But a caveat, and we're going to come back to a bunch of caveats throughout this talk, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have a more effective military. And I threw up a picture of a destroyed Russian tank here, because I think in the last, couple of months, 6 months or so, we've been seeing this caveat operate in real time. Russia used its oil wealth to build up its military during the period, sort of on and off with oil prices, but during the period 2000 to today, it turns out it didn't yield the military effectiveness that leadership in the Kremlin thought it was going to. And we've seen this happen in other petrostates, Libya, Saddam Hussein's Iraq. And so, it's kind of an interesting fact simply to note that petrostates, if they use their oil wealth wisely, then they can probably get a lot of military effectiveness out of it. If, on the other hand, their spending is, weighed down by corruption, or it's spent in foolish ways, or leaders don't use it for a wise purpose, it doesn't necessarily matter in the end. Here's another way states can use their oil wealth. The sponsorship of proxies, right? So violent proxies, terror groups, separatists in neighboring countries, nonviolent proxies, right? Funding for political parties in other countries. We've seen various African states do this. We've seen Russia do this. And this chart, again, I'm afraid got cut off just a little. Would you mind closing the live transcription box?
It's like a separate monitor up there. So if you use that mouse, you'll be able to.
Okay, there we go. That will help a little. So this is just some crosstab data, but you can see, oil wealthy states are more likely to sponsor rebel groups, more likely to sponsor all external actors than states in general. Their numbers actually look pretty similar to those of what we might call the major powers or the great powers. And we know the great powers are more likely to sponsor proxies because they engage in competition with one another. Petrostates seem to do it too, and wealth is the most obvious explanation. It's far less problematic diplomatically, politically, to fund hands-off a rebellion in your neighbor than it is to simply attack them. Petrostates seem to avail themselves of that option relatively frequently. And it's not all bad. I should say it's not all bad. Petrostates also tend to give more in foreign aid. Whether that is Norway, that has built an entire foreign policy based around using its oil wealth for charitable purposes, or whether that is, and this is sort of Middle Eastern states, the Gulf states that take the Islamic mandate for charity very seriously, and spend quite a lot of that oil wealth on foreign and humanitarian aid in some cases. And what this chart really shows is just the difference between oil-rich states and states in the region that are not oil-rich. The ones that are oil wealthy are net contributors of aid. The ones that don't have oil or have a small amount of oil are net recipients of aid. And that pattern holds up internationally. And the book, if you're interested, the book has a few other interesting cases on how petrostates use their wealth, including my own sort of pet peeve favorite one, which is think tanks and among the biggest contributors to Washington petrostates and among the biggest contributors to Washington think tanks. Norway and a bunch of the Gulf states. And so, it's interesting. You can use that wealth to buy yourself influence. And so there's some interesting case studies in the book talking about that. But again, we come to our caveat, right? Wealth is limited in that petrostates do have to plan for oil's volatility. So for those that don't know, oil is one of the world's most volatile commodities with boom-bust cycles that are often quite devastating for the states that actually produce the oil, which suffer severe budgetary shortfalls as the price of oil goes down if there's too much oil on the market. This chart is a look at what's known, or what economists call, the break-even point, the break-even fiscal point for some petrostates. Basically, these are barrel of oil prices. If the price of oil globally falls below that barrel benchmark, and I think these figures are from 2014, but if the price falls below this point, these petrostates budgets no longer balance. And so, it's just an interesting illustration. So, for some petrostates that maybe spend a lot beyond their means, like Bahrain, 97.7 is a pretty high price for a barrel of oil. That's not, even in the last 20 years, that's not common. They're going to have a much harder time of it if the oil price slides than, for example, Kuwait is down here at $50 a barrel, like half of what the Bahrainis assumed the oil price was going to be. So there's this caveat that, wealth can be easy come, easy go for some of these states. Okay, so the resource curse and foreign policy. This is kind of the second way that we can think about oil impacting foreign policy. And this one's a little less obvious than money, so bear with me. The resource curse is disputed in whether it exists. It's disputed in terms of magnitude. But I think most observers agree that there is something about oil that tends to drive corruption, weak institutionalization, poor economic performance in petrostates, even though they have this bounty of energy resources. And this is an area where all the studies basically been in domestic politics, but there are clear and obvious implications for foreign policy too. If your state is extremely weakly institutionalized, if it's underdeveloped, then we're going to see fewer constraints on leaders when they make decisions. We're going to potentially see underdeveloped foreign ministry, diplomatic service, intelligence services. And we're going to be more likely in many of these sort of corrupt or authoritarian systems to see a personality-driven foreign policy. And so I've got a few strong men up here for you guys to look at, but I also want to emphasize, you see Putin, you see Saddam Hussein, both made really quite terrible personal choices to start wars that ended up backfiring on their states. Saddam Hussein in the Gulf War, Vladimir Putin in what we're watching now. But it's not limited to those states, right? The Saudis have invaded Yemen multiple times in the last 20 years, and they've been beaten basically every time, yet they keep doing it. So there is something about foreign policy in these states, the way that institutions are constructed and the way that personality drives foreign policy, and the literature and domestic politics of the resource curse suggests that oil has a role here. So move on fairly quickly from that one. We can talk about that more in Q&A if people are interested. The third kind of pathway is what we might call global influence, market share, the weight that a country has in the international system. And this is kind of where we get closest to energy security questions. We're just coming at it from the other side, right? We're coming at it from the point of view of producing states who may have the ability to raise or lower prices in the international market, who might have the ability to leverage their oil exports for political or economic benefits in other spaces. So first, just let me detour very quickly into who the most important states in the international market are, because I think this isn't always obvious. So these numbers are a little outdated, but they're pretty representative still. The US is the biggest global producer of oil. We're also the biggest global producer of oil and gas combined. And that's been the case for several years now. We're about, the Russians and the Saudis are the next sort of down. We are the top 3 producers between the 3 countries, and no one else really comes close. So it's kind of the big 3, and then there's a variety of states that clock in about 5% of world supply. Everything from, you'll see Iran on here, unsurprisingly, you'll see Iraq, you'll see the UAE, you'll see Canada. You might be more surprised to see China on here, right? China's a major international producer of oil. They just use everything they have, and then they need to import so much more that they're actually energy insecure. And this is the position America was in back in the 1980s. So this is quite a common phenomenon in the international market. So let me, I guess, elaborate on that just a second. This is the point that I was bringing up earlier about producing versus exporting. This chart is the ratio of your production to your consumption. So how much of what your country produces do you consume domestically? And, down here, below 1, we've got, the United States, China, Brazil, the UK is close to 1, Canada's a little over 1 at this point. That just means that those countries either don't produce enough to meet their own demand, or they produce only about enough to meet their own demand. So that one line, that ratio of 1 to 1, below that, you're a net importer of energy to meet your energy needs. Above that, then it starts to become much less a dependence. You're not dependent on the world. Instead, as a producer, the world is quite dependent on you. And so the biggest ratios are in places like Norway, Qatar. The Saudis are up here around, they produce about 4 times what they consume domestically. So the exporters have more weight in the international system. And again, I'm happy to answer questions about that if that's at all confusing. Just as an aside, or another caveat, these things are not static. These can shift over time. And what we have seen over the last decade or so, everybody's aware of the big US shift where we have become a net producer, and all of the sort of positive things that brings for the domestic economy. Canada has experienced the same transition where they basically, their production has gone up, making them a net exporter. But if you look at Indonesia, right, Indonesian supplies have come down below consumption. They're no longer a net exporter. China, which I think is, I'm pretty sure this one is China. Sorry, it's blocks off here. This one's China. That line that diverges so sharply up the top is demand. Chinese productions remain pretty stable over time, even growing a little. But the demand has grown so much that China is now a net importer. So these things don't necessarily stay the same over time. Okay, so that's kind of the situation. None of that really tells us why your production on a global scale might matter for foreign policy. And I would say there's 2 ways you can think about this: soft oil power and hard oil power, for just shorthand. So one is that you might be able to leverage that oil into political or economic benefits. So other geopolitical benefits for your country that come out of being such a big producer. I'll give you just a few examples of this. A state like Qatar, right? Tiny population, insignificant location, gets invited to the G20, right? So states that wouldn't otherwise be important, get presidential visits from the US. Back during the Cold War, they get fought over by the US and the Soviets. And they're able to leverage that market power to get themselves some political benefits sometimes. The most extreme case of which is the Saudis and the Kuwaitis, who managed to leverage that into international protection during the 1990s, right? The Gulf War, and then the missions that came afterwards. They actually managed to leverage that into, what you might call like a hegemonic umbrella. And the Kuwaitis in particular, during the tanker war, played the US and the Soviets off against one another to get that outcome. The book also has a statistical study where I basically take some sanctions data and I look to see, how being a big global producer shapes your relationship with sort of the global sanctions network. And what I found is that, these big super producing states, super exporting states, they get sanctioned less than other comparable states. Maybe they're autocracies, maybe they have terrible human rights records, they get sanctioned less. They themselves are more likely to implement economic sanctions on other states than comparable neighbors. So, that's a proxy, and it's a very rough, not particularly satisfying proxy. But again, it suggests that there is something unique about these countries in terms of soft power. And then there's the hard power, right? What some people call the oil weapon, oil and gas weapon, you might hear sometimes. And I do a study in one chapter of the book looking at the oil weapon. And I look at about 20 cases. You can see them up here. They're probably a little hard to read. But I look at about sort of 20 cases of where states tried to use shutoffs or threats of shutoffs of oil or natural gas to coerce political opponents. And I found a couple of things. So one is that it's much, much easier to use gas to do this than it is oil. And that has a lot to do with the fact that oil is traded globally. It's much easier to transport. It doesn't require fixed pipelines. Gas is often transported, from one point to another, easier to use for leverage in that case. Another is that you'll notice like a lot of the cases up here are Russia. That's partly because I think people started paying attention to Russia's use of its economic statecraft and energy statecraft over the last 10, 15 years. But it's also to do with the peculiar geoeconomics of the post-Soviet space. So the Soviet Union used to be one country, right? Prior to the collapse of that country into a number of constituent parts. It was one political unit. And when pipelines were built, it was assumed the borders would not be there in the future, because why would they think that? And so many of the cases we've seen in recent years of Russia in particular attempting to use its kind of gas weapon has been because it possesses unusual leverage. States typically take these concerns into account when they build pipelines. So the Japanese and the Russians and the Chinese have been arguing for 20 years basically over whether a pipeline that's going from Russia to Japan will go through Chinese borders or not, because the Japanese don't want it to. And actually at the end of the day, what happened was they built the pipeline around the Russian border and built a spur into China to deal with those Japanese concerns. In the post-Soviet space, nobody did that thinking. So there's a path dependence that means we're seeing more use of the energy weapon in that space than elsewhere. And then sort of the third thing that I found is that the oil weapon or the gas weapon really is a form of economic statecraft. It is extremely analogous to sanctions. Across these cases, we see very similar problems with them, as we often do to sanctions. If the use of the oil weapon or the gas weapon is unilateral, not multilateral, if states can get their oil or gas somewhere else, it doesn't work. The oil weapon is better at imposing economic pain than actually coercing policy change. This is something we've seen over and over in the sanctions space. I look at the 1973 oil crisis in the book. The Arab countries were moderately successful in creating economic pain in the West, didn't cause policy change. And this is again repeated over and over. You'll see there's a lot of failures in this outcome column here. And then, the other way it's analogous to sanctions is there are diminishing returns to this. And I think, the situation that we're seeing today in Europe with Russian gas is perhaps the best illustration that there could be of this. Russia is attempting to use its leverage as a major energy producer to push European states to stop supporting Ukraine. But European states have now initiated a long-term transition away from Russian energy. So in many ways, what I found across these cases is the oil weapon or the gas weapon is mostly a one-time weapon. It's mostly a one-time use thing. Because once you've used it, states start to transition away from you because they think you're an unreliable supplier. So, this is, I think, given current politics, something really interesting that sort of the book obviously doesn't address the current crisis, but the implications are there. Okay, I've talked for quite a while. Let me very quickly wrap up with just a little bit on looking forward, and then we can take some questions. So the last chapter of the book basically attempts to take everything that we've sort of talked about so far and look forward, because the energy market and the global energy landscape is undergoing tectonic shifts right now. Some of the biggest changes, some of you may already have studied this, but if you haven't, the production using new technologies, the most common of which, or the best known of which, is the shale revolution that allowed for a lot of production in places that hadn't been possible before. The development of liquefaction, that's a technique that lets you ship natural gas around the world more easily without using pipelines. The development of renewables and the shift towards more green technology. It's still in its infancy, but it is beginning to shape global energy markets. And the end result has been, particularly with the shale revolution, a shifting locus of production that used to be almost entirely concentrated or largely concentrated in Russia, the Middle East. Now there's much more production in the West than there used to be. And with the sort of the green transition, there's the potential for energy to come from places much closer to home than it did before. So I guess let me just highlight a few big points that I think are a few big ways that might matter for the foreign policy of petrostates and the things we've talked about so far. These are just some charts showing where the biggest shifts in production in recent years are. You can see, as I mentioned, the United States is by far the biggest winner here. This is million barrels of oil. In percentage terms, it's a little more mixed, right? So, states that were already producing, some have seen increases, some have seen decreases. But the big implications might be, one, that we may see a new generation of petrostates, particularly countries in Africa and in Latin America, where offshore production has become much more possible and much cheaper in recent years. But a second point would be that these states, I think, also face a very interesting and hostile international environment. What some scholars have described as sort of a green paradox. In order to actually get the money for their resources, these states have an incentive to extract it and sell it as fast as possible in order to get ahead of any green transition that drives the world away from carbon fuels. And so, these petrostates, these new petrostates, may be in a very difficult situation where they want to benefit from this bounty, but the cash flows in the initial years will be significant. And so this poses governance concerns, this poses climate concerns. For existing petrostates, over the long run, this will, in general, probably be bad for them. But there's some really interesting work out there looking at how, different petrostates might actually benefit from it. So at the end of the day, if the world is mostly off of oil, but some states are still on oil, it's going to be the lowest cost producer. That's probably going to be the Saudis or the Emiratis, that's going to still benefit from the sale of oil. And as we've seen over the last, again, 6 months or so, the transition is not going to be smooth. And, Megan O'Sullivan and Jason Bordoff of Columbia have written a really good piece on this in Foreign Affairs just a few weeks back, that petrostates may actually benefit from the bumpiness in this process. Some of the big swings we've seen in the oil market over the last few months have been partly because states and governments and companies simply don't know quite what to expect next year. And so oil is becoming more volatile. And I guess let me just conclude with this chart, because again, I think, the number one question I got asked while writing this book is, oh, so America's a petrostate, then does that drive our foreign policy? I think you could make an argument that it helped to drive some of our foreign policy in the early years of the 20th century when we were a major producer, not so much in the latter half of the 20th century. But today, as production is going up, as we're importing far less oil, being a global producer is giving the United States leverage. The US is already a great power. It doesn't necessarily need to leverage its oil in order to get lots of benefits. But it does have foreign policy and energy security benefits, having this production at home, being able to backstop allies and other countries with this production. So, the fact that America is sort of pushing up into the ranks of super producers is a really interesting shift with implications for how we think about international security. So I will stop there. I've probably been talking for far too long. There's a lot more in the book. It's kind of a set of interconnected explorations of some of these issues. And so I'm happy to take questions on, what I've been talking about or related issues. I think there was one in the chat, but if there's any in the room, let's maybe take one in the room first. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd love to go into a little bit more detail if you could about the point you made about sanctions, which I thought was interesting. Could you just go into a little bit more detail about how you measured a sanction for a particular petrostate? Just because I know that a relevant state could be designated for multiple different reasons. So I was just curious about how you were able to decide, oh, this was a sanction for a petrostate versus one that was maybe a little bit irrelevant or something that didn't quite fall into what you were looking for.
Yeah. So do you mean if they were sanctioned specifically on issues related to oil production and export?
So I guess in other words, how did you quantify a designation as being imposed on a petrostate? So as opposed to maybe,
okay.
I don't know, an Iranian general who was designated for maybe human rights abuse or something like that?
Okay, so the short answer is I didn't. I relied heavily on particularly the TIES data set. That's the threat and imposition of sanctions data set, which measures both threatening sanctions and imposing sanctions. And I just coded, any sanction applied to a state, if they are a petrostate by the measures that, the other measures, then that counted as a sanction against a petrostate. It didn't really matter what issue it was on. I did do some breakdowns to look at the issues, and, not multivariate analysis on that question, obviously, but I will say it was quite notable the petrostates were far lower on human rights sanctions. Pretty comparable on like corruption and kingpin sanctions, though, which not surprising perhaps, but on on sanctions that were just aimed at governments generally trying to get them to improve their human rights and stuff, that's where the biggest drop off came.
We have sorry.
Yeah, let's get the online question. We'll come to you next. Thanks.
Yeah, so from the chat, what did you find were the reasons that military spending increases as oil prices increase?
Yeah, so it's funny because so I didn't do a study of I didn't do a study of the reasons that drive petrostates to spend more money on their militaries. But what I did do was demonstrate an empirical regularity that had long been assumed to be a fact, and actually no one had ever tested, which is pretty crazy when you think about it. It had long been assumed that petrostates simply spent more money on their military. It's shot through all the literature on sort of Middle East military spending. There are a variety of country studies that go into depth in different states. So there's some good work on Algeria that I cite in the book. There's some work on Iraq that I cite in the book that basically talk about how the oil sort of pushes it. Perhaps the most extreme case actually is Chile, which is, it's not oil or gas wealth, so it doesn't really fit in the book, but they get a lot of income from copper and other resources. And the Chilean military actually, round about the time they transitioned to democratic rule, managed to have it written into the constitution that they get a certain percentage of the revenue from natural resources. So what I did in the book is I basically looked across a broad spectrum of these states to see how military spending is correlated with prices, oil prices in these states, how that shifts over time. Are there other factors that could explain it? And so I guess, again, as I said at the start, sort of, I didn't answer every question in this book. I am very open about the fact that this is like a potential research agenda for a lot of people. So, I think there could be some really interesting research on, why is it that these countries choose to spend more on their military? One comment that I will make is, I did find, a lot of different measures where states spent more. One measure where petrostates didn't spend more, and that's as a percentage of GDP. And so, the way at least I came to think of it is that petrostates have a bigger pie than other states. More money for social spending, more money for the dictator to sock away in Swiss bank accounts, more money for military spending. But the size of the military expenditure slice of that pie, it's not any bigger than comparable non-oil states. So it's really just that they spend more on everything. And I suspect that if you went and did a bunch of country studies, that is probably what you would find. Okay, yes, I see a question back there.
Did you see any change in a country's foreign policy or crises if the petrostates production declined? So I'm kind of thinking of like the Soviet Union in the 80s or Libya post 2011. Did you see any changes there?
Yeah, so the Libya problem is that it's correlated like 100% with the fall of Gaddafi and the civil war. So that's not going to work out. Venezuela is a really interesting case, though. So the Venezuelans use their oil wealth really aggressively. Basically, after Hugo Chavez comes to power, he has a very different political agenda than his predecessors in Venezuela. And he uses the oil wealth very aggressively to push that political agenda. So everything from paying for socialists' election campaigns elsewhere in Latin America, donating food to the poor to try and drum up election support for those candidates elsewhere. He even, this one's kind of crazy, at one point he had a campaign inside the US to pay for heating fuel for poor Americans that the Bush administration had cut some benefits for. And this was publicized on TV here in America. So he used the oil wealth to do a lot of that. He sent subsidized oil to countries in the Caribbean. And then even before Chavez's death, as the Venezuelan economy starts to crater, that drops off. So I mean, again, this is a pretty logical thing, right? That as the money drops off, that stuff that's pretty extraneous and unnecessary drops off. But we do see that. We also see the Venezuelans stopped making major military purchases internationally, or at least the number of them fell substantially. The number of prestige weapons systems they were buying dropped off. So that's one of the clearer examples I can say where, I think we've seen just such a marked decline in how the Venezuelan oil production has dropped off, and their foreign policy does match pretty closely to it.
Thank you.
Did I see we have some more questions or those comments?
Yes, we've got another. How does the resource curse phenomenon play differently across different resources? Is there anything different in the case of oil as compared to other resources?
Yeah, this is a great question. So if you're interested in this, I encourage you to find like a political economy class that does resource curse literature, because there is so much I couldn't possibly summarize it. But one of the things I do at the start of the book is I have a chapter that basically takes these definitions of petrostates and then tests whether petrostates in these different categories are more likely to start wars than other states. This is one of the claims in some of the literature on energy security and oil and security. As part of that analysis, I don't just assess oil, I assess oil, natural gas, and then a variety of different resource metrics. And what I found is a very strong connection for actually all three groups of states between oil and conflict initiation. They start more wars, all three groups of states. Even when you control for other factors, I found a hard to discern relationship between gas and these questions, but that's mostly because there is only one country that's a major gas producer that doesn't also have oil. So we cannot base a generalization on Turkmenistan, I'm afraid. But then when you get into other resources, the relationship just drops out entirely. Timber, diamonds, other minerals, rare earth metals, all these things, there's just no connection between conflict and these resources. And so this kind of led me to conclude, similar to what other people have ended up concluding in different parts of the resource curse literature, that there really is something relatively unique about oil or oil and gas together. The fossil fuels, the hydrocarbons, the ones that are energy resources do seem to be somewhat unique. And we can talk a little more about why that is if people want, but that's why the book focuses on those resources and not on others.
That's everything in the chat.
Yeah.
So you talked about diminishing returns when using the oil or gas weapon. I wondered if you could talk about the current situation in Russia and Europe. So what do you see the long-term ending for Russia? I mean, we're looking at 2 cold winters. I mean, Europe is going to transition in 3 or 4 years. So how is this going?
Yeah. So I guess to step back and just make one point about what's happening right now with Russian oil and gas. This is a crisis that I think most people that work in energy just assumed would never happen. And that is not because Russia has proven itself to be trustworthy, because they obviously haven't, but because it was long assumed that Russia would never deny itself European gas revenues just to hurt European states. And what changed is that European states decided they were actually willing to go through pain to get away from Russian hydrocarbons and to aid Ukraine. And so the Russian response was to start dialing down the gas. Basically, we were in a situation of mutual interdependence between Russia and Europe. And when Europe said, we're not going to rely on you anymore, the Russians said, fine, we are not going to give you any either. And this is such a damaging proposition for both sides that I think most people assumed it could never have happened. So that's kind of that's sort of an aside, but I think it's really important to understand that this is not like one of the cases that we had up here, you know, Russia cutting off some gas to Moldova over a pricing dispute. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a sizable chunk of the world market, as you say, potentially disastrous cuts to Europe in the middle of the winter, almost certainly going to cause a recession, potentially going to leave people freezing in their houses, right? So this is a huge problem. What I mean by diminishing returns, though, is that if Europe can weather that winter or those 2 winters and successfully transition to other supplies, then Russia doesn't have that leverage at all anymore. In fact, Russia will be in a worse situation because you can't just build pipelines overnight either, and they'll have no one to buy their gas. So, you know, I mean, I am not 100% sure this was necessarily a wise decision on the part of the Europeans, or indeed on the part of the Russians. But that's what I mean by diminishing returns, is that once Russia has used its leverage this way once, they're not going to be able to do it again if Europe successfully shifts away. Any other questions or thoughts?
Then the G7 just proposed like a price cap for Russian oil. How will that interplay into the economic system?
Yeah, so the price cap. Okay, so I want to come back to a point that I made a few minutes ago. Gas versus oil, right? So again, we already had the oil market disruption related to the war in Ukraine, or at least most of it. That was when prices spiked over the summer. I think they were highest around about July 4th. And that was because Europe was saying, we're not going to take more Russian oil, which meant they had to get supplies from elsewhere. The people that were using that oil that the Europeans now wanted had to get their oil from elsewhere. It was like a giant game of musical chairs in the international oil market, made possible by the fact that you can just stick oil in a tanker and you can sail that ship into all kinds of places. It's quite easy to do. And so that was the oil disruption. The gas disruption is very different. It's because you can't move that fixed infrastructure. They're dependent on pipelines. There are limits to the LNG terminals available, etc. So the coming crisis in the winter is going to be predominantly about gas in Europe. This is all made more complicated, by the way, by the fact that Americans use gas to meet oil. So natural gas is where the crisis is going to be in the winter. The price cap is on oil, however, and it's a really nifty idea. right? It's a really interesting idea. The theory is that the US will not sanction Russian oil so long as those oil cargoes are priced below a certain dollar amount per barrel. So below, let's say $30. I don't know what they've actually chosen. Below $30, it's perfectly legal to trade in Russian oil, to insure Russian oil in Europe and the US. Above that amount, $35, $40, it's not legal, and you will get penalized if your company trades in it, or insures in it. I believe insurance is how they plan to manage this. So that's the theory. The idea is they'll cause Russian revenues to decline without actually taking Russian oil off the market, causing a shortage. I'm not sure if it's going to work in practice, right? It's very novel. It requires extreme amounts of intelligence and information, right? So the assumption is the insuring ships are going to know exactly where the oil comes from, where it's going, you know, that the ships are loaded with certain quantity. There's going to be a lot of cheating, and it's going to be really hard to enforce. Maybe it'll still work. It also relies on convincing Chinese, the Indians, the Indonesians, etc., to actually abide by it. And the theory is they will, because they'll get cheap oil for it. Maybe they will. But again, I suspect there'll be a lot of cheating going on there. And it also relies on the Russians being willing to accept the lower price. And again, the theory is that the Russians will take any revenue rather than no revenue at all. I'm not sure that assumption is necessarily correct. So all of that by way of saying this is a really interesting and novel idea. I don't know if it's going to work in practice, but even if it doesn't, I think the hope is that doing this price cap will reassure markets that the US isn't actually going to sanction Russian oil in some broader way, you know, so there won't be shortfalls down the road, so it's safe to trade. And so, I mean, I think they have multiple goals here, and some of that one might be more successful than the actual price cap. Any other questions? That was rather a convoluted answer.
No more in the chat.
Okay, well, thank you all so much for coming. I really appreciate it. Yeah, thanks.